On a disease-ridden, jungle-choked island that no one had ever heard of, the fate of the Pacific War was about to be decided. For months, a few thousand U.S. Marines had clung to a muddy airstrip, surrounded and outnumbered. Now, 14,000 elite soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army, masters of the jungle and believers in their own spiritual invincibility, were preparing to launch an attack they were certain would annihilate the defenders. They waited for the Americans to break. What they got instead was a storm of fire and steel that would go down in the annals of military history. This is the story of the desperate, brutal, and bloody battle for Henderson Field. If you want to witness one of the most determined last stands in the history of the U.S. Marine Corps, smash that like button and subscribe for more tales of battlefield courage. What do you think is the most legendary last stand in all of military history? Let us know in the comments below. Now, to the island of Guadalcanal. October 23, 1942. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The island was not a strategic prize. It was a malarial hell. A place of perpetual steaming rain, razor-sharp kunai grass, and impenetrable vine-choked jungle. The ground was a slurry of mud, the air thick with mosquitoes, and the nights filled with the unnerving sounds of the deep wilderness. Yet on this god-forsaken patch of earth, the Empire of Japan and the United States of America were locked in a death struggle. The reason was a 4,000-foot strip of dirt and coral scraped from the jungle. Henderson Field. This was no mere runway. It was an unsinkable aircraft carrier, a fixed point in the vast Pacific from which air power could dominate the sea lanes between the US and its vital ally, Australia. For the Allies, holding it meant stopping the Japanese juggernaut. For the Japanese, taking it meant severing Australia from the American war machine and consolidating their Pacific empire. For 2 months, the US 1st Marine Division, under the command of Major General Alexander Vandergrift, had held this critical ground. They were exhausted, sick, and starving. Nightly, the Japanese destroyers of the Tokyo Express raced down the channel known as the Slot to shell their positions and land fresh troops. Daily, Japanese bombers from Rabaul flew down to pound the airfield. The Marines were a threadbare force, their uniforms rotting off their backs, their bodies racked with malaria and dysentery, their diet reduced to captured Japanese rice and the occasional air-dropped ration. They were outnumbered and outgunned in every category except one: the organized, systematic application of industrial firepower. Around the airfield, they had constructed a defensive masterpiece, a perimeter of interlocking machine gun nests, barbed wire entanglements, and pre-plotted artillery fields of fire that stretched for over 22,000 yards. They had turned the terrain into a weapon, a scientifically designed killing field. The Japanese, however, were supremely confident. The commander of the 17th Army, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, had arrived on the island to personally oversee the final destruction of the American Marines. He held the Americans in contempt, viewing them as soft, materialistic soldiers who lacked the spiritual strength, the Yamato Damashi, of the Japanese warrior. His plan for the offensive was bold, complex, and built upon this fatal underestimation of his enemy. It was a 3-pronged assault designed to shatter the Marine perimeter. The first prong would be a diversionary attack on the western flank, across the Matanical River, led by a powerful force of infantry and 9 Type 95 Hago tanks. The second would be a massive artillery bombardment from the west, designed to suppress the defenders and sow chaos. The third and main effort was a colossal flanking maneuver. A force of 7,000 of the finest infantrymen of the Sendai Division, commanded by Major General Masao Maruyama, would undertake a grueling 25-mile march through what the Americans considered impassable jungle to strike the soft, undefended southern edge of the Marine perimeter. Hyakutake's plan was a classic of Japanese military doctrine: achieve surprise through a difficult maneuver, then overwhelm the enemy with the bayonet. The plan's greatest flaw was the same spiritual arrogance that conceived it. The Japanese commanders, looking at their maps, saw the jungle as a challenge to be overcome by willpower. They failed to understand it as a logistical problem to be solved by engineering and industrial capacity. The so-called Maruyama Road was not a road at all, but a narrow, muddy footpath hacked through the densest jungle on Earth. The march, intended to take 3 days, devolved into a week-long nightmare. The terrain was a vertical hell of steep ravines and tangled swamps. Soldiers, already on half rations, were forced to haul heavy equipment by hand. The jungle itself seemed to fight back. Men sank to their waists in mud, vines tore at their flesh, and the constant torrential rain turned the trail into a river of sludge. The reality of industrial warfare began to assert itself. Heavy equipment, the product of factories and foundries, could not be moved by willpower alone. The Japanese were forced to abandon their most critical weapons. First, the 75mm and 105mm artillery pieces were left behind, their wheels hopelessly bogged down. Then went the heavy machine guns and the mortars. Finally, in desperation, the soldiers themselves began to discard their ammunition, their packs, and even their spare rations, keeping only their rifles and bayonets. When Maruyama's main force finally stumbled out of the jungle and into position on the evening of October 24th, they were not the elite assault force that had begun the march. They were a starving, exhausted, and disorganized mob, stripped of their heavy firepower, their communications in chaos, and their attack plan hours behind schedule. They were left with only their rifles and their belief in the supremacy of the bayonet charge. They were about to launch a spiritual attack against an industrial defense, and the result would be a slaughter. While the main Japanese force was still lost in the jungle, the first prong of Hyakutaki's attack began on the night of October 23rd. This was the tank assault across the sandbar at the mouth of the Matanikau River. The Japanese commanders believed the thinly held marine lines there would crumble before the shock of an armored assault. They were mistaken. The Marines of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, commanded by the legendary Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, were waiting for them. Their defenses were a textbook example of anti-tank warfare. The Marines had dug in their 37mm anti-tank guns, perfectly sighted to create an interlocking field of fire across the sandbar. They had wrapped barbed wire around coconut logs, creating obstacles that were invisible in the dark. Their artillery, located miles away, had already zeroed in on the sandbar with chilling precision. They knew the Japanese were coming. The only question was when. Just after dusk, the attack began. 9 Type 95. Heigo tanks, their engines roaring, clattered out of the jungle and onto the open sandbar, accompanied by a wave of infantry. It was a terrifying sight, the very picture of modern mechanized assault. But the Marines did not panic. They held their fire with iron discipline, waiting for the lead tanks to reach the center of their pre-planned kill zone. Then, a single flare hissed into the sky, bathing the entire scene in a cold, white light. In that instant, every weapon the Marines had was unleashed. The 37mm guns firing canister shot became giant shotguns, shredding the charging Japanese infantry. Firing armor-piercing rounds, they slammed into the thin-skinned Japanese tanks. The Hago, with its half-inch of armor, was no match for the high-velocity shells. The lead tank was hit, exploded, and brewed up in a ball of fire. A second was hit and slewed to a halt, its turret blown clean off. A third was hit and disabled, its crew trying to bail out before being cut down by machine gun fire. Within 5 minutes, the entire Japanese armored force was a line of burning, smoking scrap metal. The accompanying infantry, with no cover and no armor support, were massacred. They were caught in a perfectly triangulated crossfire of machine guns, rifles, and artillery shells that rained down from the sky. The attack was not repulsed. It was annihilated. The first prong of the Great Japanese Offensive had been broken with brutal mechanical efficiency. The Marines had used their industrial weapons, their superior artillery, their effective anti-tank guns, their vast supplies of ammunition, to utterly crush an enemy assault. The sandbar at the mouth of the Matanikau was littered with the bodies of over 600 Japanese soldiers and the wreckage of their entire tank company. The cost to the Marines: 2 men killed. The disparity in casualties was a horrifying preview of what was to come. It was a clear demonstration of what happened when the warrior spirit of the bayonet met the industrial logic of the machine gun. While the tank attack was being shattered, the main event was building in the south. Maruyama's starving soldiers, having finally reached their jump-off points hours late, were preparing to launch their assault against the southern perimeter. This sector was held by a single, under-strength battalion, the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, the same unit that had just destroyed the tank attack and had been hastily trucked to the southern line to reinforce it. They were now joined by the men of the U.S. Army's 164th Infantry Regiment. The focal point of the defense was a long, grassy ridge that rose out of the jungle, offering a clear line of sight towards Henderson Field. This ridge had already been the scene of a brutal battle a month earlier, earning it the name Bloody Ridge, or Edson's Ridge. The Marines, under the direction of Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller and Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hall, had prepared their defenses with meticulous care. They had strung thousands of yards of barbed wire. They had dug their machine gun nests into the coral of the ridge, creating mutually supporting pillboxes. They had registered every gully, every draw, every likely avenue of approach with their 75mm and 105mm howitzers. Their telephone lines were buried, connecting the frontline observers directly to the fire direction center of the artillery. They had turned a simple hill into a fortress of science and death. As darkness fell on October 24th, a torrential downpour began, turning the battlefield into a sea of mud and further disrupting Japanese communications. Maruyama, unable to coordinate his exhausted and scattered units, launched his attack piecemeal. Small groups of Japanese soldiers, chanting battle cries, began to emerge from the jungle, their bayonets fixed. They ran headlong into the barbed wire. The Marine machine gunners, holding their fire until the last possible second, opened up. The interlocking fields of fire worked with devastating effect. Heavy machine guns, firing 500 rounds per minute, scythed through the Japanese ranks. The attackers were cut down in droves, their bodies piling up on the wire. The Japanese officers, leading from the front as was their custom, were the first to die, cut down by riflemen who had been trained to identify and eliminate enemy leaders. The initial probes were shattered, but this was only the beginning. Throughout the night, the Japanese launched a series of fanatical, uncoordinated assaults. They showed incredible bravery, charging again and again into the teeth of the Marine defenses. Some managed to cut through the wire, only to be met by Marines fighting with grenades, knives, and bayonets in their own trenches. The true hero of the battle, however, was not a man, but a system. It was the American artillery. Marine forward observers, hidden in listening posts just yards from the Japanese, spoke calmly into their field telephones, calling down fire. The response was almost instantaneous. The gun crews of the 11th Marines, located miles away, never saw the enemy. They simply received coordinates, loaded their howitzers, and fired. They unleashed a storm of high-explosive shells that blanketed the Japanese assembly areas and approach routes. They fired over 6,000 shells that night. The effect was apocalyptic. The jungle in front of the Marine lines was systematically shredded, entire groves of trees leveled. The ground churned into a bloody pulp. The Japanese attacks were broken up before they could even form, their soldiers killed by an invisible, implacable enemy they could not fight back against. It was industrial warfare in its purest form. A handful of observers, connected by a simple copper wire to a dozen guns, were able to call upon a level of firepower that an entire Japanese division could not match. The spiritual power of the banzai charge was being crushed by the simple, brutal arithmetic of high explosives. As the night of October 24th wore on, the Japanese attacks grew in ferocity and desperation. General Maruyama, realizing his initial uncoordinated assaults had failed, managed to rally his forces for a more concentrated push. The main effort was directed at a shallow saddle between two knolls on the ridge, a natural funnel for any attacking force. This area, defended by the Marines of Company C, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, would become known as the Coffin Corner. Here, the Japanese 29th Infantry Regiment, under the personal command of Colonel Masajiro Furumiya, launched a determined assault. They came in waves, screaming banzai and blood for the Emperor. They charged through the mud and the driving rain, their bayonets gleaming in the light of the constant flares. They were not simply running at the enemy. They were attempting to physically overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers and spiritual fervor. The Marines in the Coffin Corner met this charge with a calm, murderous efficiency. They were no longer just soldiers, they were technicians of slaughter. The heavy, water-cooled Browning M1917 machine guns, emplaced in sandbagged pits, became the anchors of the defense. Each gun was a finely tuned machine, capable of firing 500 rounds per minute for sustained periods without overheating. A single gun could fire over 30,000 rounds in a night, a level of ammunition consumption that was simply inconceivable to the Japanese, who had been forced to discard their own spare bullets in the jungle. The gunners did not spray their fire wildly. They fired in short, controlled bursts, traversing their guns back and forth across the waves of attackers at waist level. The effect was that of a giant invisible scythe. Entire lines of charging Japanese soldiers were simply cut down, their bodies piling up in grotesque heaps on the barbed wire. The sound was a continuous, deafening roar, a mechanical hammer of death that never ceased. Despite the horrific losses, the Japanese pressed on. A few dozen soldiers, showing incredible courage, managed to crawl under the streams of machine gun fire and breach the wire. They surged into a gap that had opened between two Marine companies. For a few desperate minutes, the fighting devolved into a primitive, close-quarters brawl. Marines and Japanese soldiers fought in the mud-filled trenches with bayonets, trench knives, and bare hands. This was the kind of fight the Japanese had wanted, a contest of spirit and steel. But even here, the American industrial advantage asserted itself. The Marines were armed with the M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle, a weapon that could fire 8 rounds as fast as a man could pull the trigger. The Japanese soldier, with his bolt-action Arisaka rifle, could fire 1 round for every 3 to 5 rounds from a Marine. In the chaos of the melee, this difference in firepower was decisive. The Japanese breakthrough was contained and then annihilated, not by superior spirit but by a superior rate of fire. At this critical moment, another element of American power came into play: flexible, real-time command and control, enabled by a robust communications network. Chesty Puller, the battalion commander, seemed to be everywhere at once. He moved calmly along the front lines, ignoring the sniper fire and shell fragments, redeploying his men, directing reinforcements and steadying the nerves of his young Marines. When the Japanese broke through, the call for help went out over the field telephones. The response came not from the Marines, but from the U.S. Army. The soldiers of the 3rd Battalion, 164th Infantry Regiment, were moved up from reserve. These were National Guardsmen from North Dakota, not hardened Marine regulars, but they moved into the breach with discipline and courage. In the darkness and the pouring rain, Army soldiers and Marines found themselves fighting shoulder to shoulder, sharing ammunition and covering each other's sectors of fire. This integration of forces, a seamless fusion of different units in the heat of battle, was something the rigid Japanese command structure could not hope to match. The gap was plugged, and the line held. As dawn approached on October 25th, the Japanese attacks finally sputtered out. The survivors of Maruyama's force melted back into the relative safety of the jungle, leaving behind a carpet of their dead. The slopes of Bloody Ridge and the wire in front of the Coffin Corner were a charnel house. Over 1,500 Japanese bodies were counted in front of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marine Sector alone. The American line, though battered, had not broken. General Hyakutake, receiving the reports at his command post, was incandescent with rage. He refused to accept the magnitude of the defeat. Convinced that the Americans were on the verge of collapse, he ordered Maruyama to gather his shattered forces and launch another all-out assault on the night of the 25th. It was a decision born of fury and a complete disconnect from reality. The American defenders spent the day of the 25th not resting, but improving their position with industrial diligence. Trucks rolled up to the front lines, delivering mountains of ammunition, grenades, and medical supplies. Engineers repaired the barbed wire and laid new minefields. Bulldozers, the unsung heroes of the Pacific War, carved out new machine gun pits. The artillerymen cleaned their howitzers and stacked thousands of fresh shells, preparing for another night of methodical destruction. That night, the Japanese attacked again. But this was not a battle. It was an act of mass suicide. The surviving Japanese soldiers, starving, demoralized, and now facing an even stronger defense, were sent forward into the same meat grinder. The result was a foregone conclusion. The Marine and Army defenders, now veterans of the previous night's slaughter, met the charges with an even greater volume of fire. The artillery, its aim perfected, fired with chilling accuracy. One artillery officer, observing the carnage, noted that the Japanese were being killed faster than they could be replaced on the front. This time there were no breakthroughs. There were no desperate melees in the trenches. The Japanese assaults were simply erased, the waves of men dissolving into red mist under the hurricane of shrapnel and machine gun fire. A few soldiers, in a final act of devotion, conducted individual suicide charges, running at the American lines with a mine held to their chests, only to be cut down hundreds of yards from their target. By midnight, it was over. The spirit of the Sendai Division was finally irrevocably broken. The survivors, no longer a coherent fighting force, stumbled back into the jungle, leaving another 1,000 of their comrades dead on the slopes of the ridge. When the sun rose on October 26th, the full scale of the Japanese disaster was revealed. The ground in front of the southern perimeter was a carpet of twisted, broken bodies, a testament to the futility of their sacrifice. In the 3 days of fighting, the Japanese 17th Army had been shattered. They had lost over 5,000 men killed in action. The elite Sendai Division had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The cost to the American defenders for holding the line was almost unbelievably low in comparison. Approximately 80 men killed. The lopsided casualty ratio was not a reflection of courage or fighting spirit. The Japanese soldiers had displayed a level of bravery that bordered on the superhuman. The difference was industrial and organizational. The Americans had won because their system was superior. They had won because of their logistics, which allowed them to stockpile ammunition. They had won because of their engineering, which allowed them to build a fortress in the jungle. They had won because of their communications, which allowed them to react to threats with speed and flexibility. And above all, they had won because of their artillery, a weapon that allowed a few men miles from the battle to obliterate thousands with mathematical precision. For the surviving Japanese soldiers, the psychological impact was devastating. Their belief in the spiritual power of the Japanese warrior, their faith in the banzai charge, had been shattered against a wall of American high explosives. They had been told the Americans were soft and decadent, yet they had witnessed a level of organized, sustained violence they could not comprehend. One Japanese officer, captured after the battle, recounted the horrifying effectiveness of the American artillery. He described how shells seemed to anticipate their every move, how entire companies were wiped out before they even saw an American soldier. He did not describe a battle. He described a form of industrial extermination. This was the moment the Japanese high command began to understand their mistake. They had believed the war in the Pacific would be a contest of wills, a spiritual struggle. The Americans were proving that it was a contest of production, logistics, and firepower. The fight for Henderson Field was not the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, but it was the decisive turning point. Never again would the Japanese be able to mount a serious ground offensive to retake the airfield. Their defeat was a microcosm of the larger war to come, a brutal lesson in the impotence of mere courage against the overwhelming systematic violence of an industrial superpower. The Japanese had waited for the Marines to break. Instead, it was their own army, their own doctrine and their own worldview that had been broken on the bloody slopes of a muddy, nameless ridge. The victory at Henderson Field was more than a successful defense. It was a brutal lesson in the changing character of war. It represented the collision of two fundamentally different military philosophies. The Imperial Japanese Army operated like a finely honed feudal weapon, a spear whose sharpness was derived from the peerless courage, discipline, and self-sacrifice of its individual warriors. It was a system that valued spirit over substance, believing that the intangible force of Yamato Damashi could overcome any material disadvantage. The United States Marine Corps, by contrast, operated as an integrated industrial killing machine. The individual Marine was brave, tough, and disciplined, but his true power was as a component in a much larger system. He was the trigger puller at the end of a vast, continent-spanning assembly line of destruction that began in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the munitions factories of the Midwest, and the engineering schools of America. The numbers from the battle tell this story with cold, irrefutable clarity. Over the 2 nights of the main assault, the Marine and Army artillery battalions fired more than 10,000 rounds of 75 fire-meets and 105 meets and high-explosive shells. This represented a weight of nearly 200,000 pounds of steel and explosives delivered onto the Japanese positions. The machine gunners of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines alone, expended over 200,000 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition. This was not a battle, it was an industrial event. The Japanese soldiers who had been forced to abandon their own limited artillery shells in the jungle were now being systematically buried under an avalanche of American steel. Each artillery shell was a product of a factory system the Japanese could not hope to match. Each bullet was a testament to a logistical chain that could transport millions of tons of supplies across 6,000 miles of ocean. The Japanese soldiers died fighting not just a few thousand Marines, but the full, terrifying might of the American industrial economy. This industrial superiority was visible in every aspect of the defense. The barbed wire that channeled the Japanese into killing zones was produced by the mile in American factories. The telephone wire that connected the observers to the guns, the lifeblood of the artillery defense, was a product of a vast communications industry. The bulldozers that carved roads and gun pits out of the jungle represented a level of engineering prowess that was simply alien to the Japanese army, which still relied on shovels and manual labor. Even the food the Marines ate, however meager, arrived on ships built in record time in American shipyards. The Japanese soldiers, starving on foraged roots, were being defeated as much by American shipbuilders and factory workers as they were by the Marines on the front line. The battle for Henderson Field was not fought in a vacuum. While the infantry duel raged on the ground, another equally critical battle was being fought in the air. The Cactus Air Force, a motley collection of Marine, Navy, and Army aircraft flying from the battered airstrip, was an integral part of the defense. During the day, F-4F Wildcat fighters and SBD Dauntless dive bombers would take off from the muddy runway, sometimes while it was still under shell fire, to hunt for the Japanese in the jungle. They added another layer of industrial death to the equation, strafing and bombing the Japanese assembly areas, destroying their supply dumps, and cutting down the survivors of the nighttime assaults as they tried to retreat. The pilots were flying on fumes, their aircraft patched with sheet metal and cannibalized parts, but they kept flying. They were the reason the battle was being fought, and their control of the skies over the island was absolute. These aircraft also played the decisive strategic role. Day after day, they flew out over the waters of the Slot to attack the destroyers and transports of the Tokyo Express. Every Japanese ship sunk meant fewer troops, less food, and less ammunition for the starving 17th Army. The battle for Henderson Field was won not just on the ridge, but also on the sea, by pilots who were slowly and systematically severing the logistical lifeline of the Japanese army. It was a 3-dimensional strategy of attrition that the Japanese, with their focus on a single decisive ground battle, could not counter. The psychological collapse that followed the physical defeat was total. Diaries found on the bodies of Japanese soldiers told a story that their commanders refused to believe. They spoke not of glorious charges, but of gnawing hunger and a terrifying bone-deep weariness. They wrote of a paralyzing fear of the American artillery, which they called the Steel Rain, an impersonal, unseen force that killed without honor or warning. They described the horror of the machine guns, which seemed to never run out of ammunition. This was the true legacy of Henderson Field. It was here, in the mud and the rain of Guadalcanal, that the myth of the invincible Japanese soldier died. His spirit had proven unbreakable, his courage absolute. But his spirit and his courage had been fed into a machine that did not care. The machine chewed up his flesh, broke his bones, and shredded his belief in the supremacy of the bayonet. The battle was the turning point of the ground war in the Pacific. It was the high-water mark of Japanese conquest. Before Henderson Field, the Japanese army had known nothing but victory. After Henderson Field, they would know nothing but a long, brutal, and bloody retreat all the way back to their home islands. The name Guadalcanal would forever be burned into the consciousness of the Japanese military, a symbol of a defeat so total it defied their understanding of the universe. The final analysis is a stark one. The Japanese brought a warrior's ethos to Guadalcanal. They believed they were waging a holy war, a contest of racial and spiritual purity. The Americans, in contrast, brought a problem-solving managerial ethos. They saw the Japanese assault not as a spiritual challenge, but as a complex logistical and engineering problem to be solved with the tools of their industrial society. They answered the Japanese bayonet charge with a telephone, a slide rule, and a howitzer. They countered the Yamato spirit with barbed wire, interlocking fields of fire, and an unending supply of ammunition. The individual Marine fighting for his life in a foxhole was the final critical element. But his victory was guaranteed by the massive industrial and organizational system that placed him there and armed him with an overwhelming superiority of fire. The Japanese had waited for the US Marines to break, but the Marines were just the leading edge of a, machine that did not know how. The machine was designed to grind, to pulverize, and to overwhelm. And on the bloody battlefields around Henderson Field, it did its job with brutal, terrifying efficiency.